She was smiling for the guests, but inside, she was breaking. The ballroom shimmered with perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast soft golden light across polished marble floors, reflecting elegance in every direction. White roses, imported from distant countries, lined the aisle in flawless symmetry. Every detail had been carefully selected, calculated, and executed to create a scene that would be remembered, not for truth, but for appearance, because in this world, appearances mattered more than reality. At the center of it all stood Elena Carter. She looked exactly like what everyone expected. Her gown was exquisite, custom designed, flowing with delicate fabric that moved like silk with every breath she took. The intricate lace traced her arms and neckline with quiet sophistication, covering her completely, while still presenting a vision of effortless beauty. Her hair was styled with precision. Each strand placed to frame her face in soft elegance. From a distance, she looked perfect, untouchable, unbreakable. But perfection, like everything else in that room, was carefully constructed, and Elena Carter had learned long ago how to wear it. Her posture remained steady as she stood at the altar, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, not trembling, never visibly trembling. She had practiced control for years. Control over expression, control over movement, control over everything that could reveal what lay beneath. Because revealing anything was never an option. Her lips curved into a soft smile, the kind expected of a bride on her wedding day. It was subtle, controlled, convincing enough for those watching. And everyone was watching. Rows of guests filled the hall, dressed in luxury that mirrored the setting itself. Powerful figures, influential names, people who did not attend events like this for celebration alone, but for connection, status, and silent agreements that shaped worlds behind closed doors. They saw beauty. They saw elegance. They saw a perfect union. What they did not see was the fracture beneath it. Elena's gaze moved slowly across the room, not searching for escape, but measuring reality. Faces blurred into one another. Smiles, conversations, quiet judgment hidden behind polite expressions. None of them mattered. None of them knew. And that was exactly how it was meant to be, because this wedding was never about her. It had never been. The music shifted softly in the background, a gentle melody designed to enhance the illusion. Everything was timed. Everything was controlled. Even this moment. Even her. Beside her stood the man she was about to marry, Daniel Hayes. He did not look at her. Not truly. His posture was rigid, his expression calm, but empty in a way that carried no warmth. His presence was strong, not in a way that comforted, but in a way that dominated space without needing to speak. He was not nervous. He was not emotional. Because for him, this was not a beginning. It was a transaction. His suit was tailored to perfection, dark and precise, matching controlled environment around him. Every detail about him reflected discipline, authority, and something colder beneath it. Control. Elena didn't need to look at him to feel it. She had felt it long before this day. Long before the dress, the ceremony, the guests. Long before she had been given the illusion of choice. Her smile didn't falter, because it couldn't. Not here. Not now. Her family stood close, positioned perfectly within view of the guests. Their expressions mirrored pride, satisfaction, approval. Everything was going exactly as planned. That was the only thing that mattered. Elena's fingers pressed lightly against each other, the only sign, small enough to remain unnoticed, of the pressure building beneath her calm exterior. Because control has limits. And today, those limits were being tested. The officiant's voice carried smoothly through the room, steady and practiced. Words about unity, commitment, future, promises that sounded meaningful, but held no weight in a situation built entirely on obligation. Elena listened, but she did not absorb, because meaning requires truth, and there was none here. Her breathing remained even, but slightly shallower than normal, not enough to draw attention, just enough to remind her this was real, this was happening, and there was no way out. The thought didn't create panic. It created something worse. Acceptance. Because when someone realizes there is no escape, they stop looking for one. Elena had reached that point long ago. Her eyes lowered slightly, just for a moment, enough to break direct contact with the crowd. It was subtle, almost invisible. But in that brief second, the mask slipped, not completely, just enough for the truth to exist, even if no one saw it. A flicker of emotion moved through her expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but real pain, not loud, not visible, but deep enough to change everything. If anyone had been paying attention, but no one was, because no one was looking for it. They were looking at her, not seeing her. The difference was everything. Her gaze lifted again, the smile returning effortlessly, as if nothing had shifted at all. The performance continued. It had to, because stopping was not allowed. Daniel's voice reached her then, low, controlled, saying something that blended into the structure of the ceremony. It didn't matter what the words were. They were part of the process. Nothing more. Elena's attention didn't move toward him, because she already understood everything about him that mattered. He did not need her. He needed what she represented: connection, access, power. And she was the bridge, not a person, a position. And positions are not given freedom. They are maintained, used, controlled. Her smile remained, but something beneath it shifted again, because awareness does not stay quiet forever. And somewhere deep inside her, something resisted, not loudly, not enough to break through, but enough to exist, enough to remind her that this wasn't right, that it had never been right. Her chest tightened slightly, a subtle pressure building beneath her controlled breathing. The weight of everything, the expectations, the silence, the years of being shaped into something she was never meant to be, pressed against her with quiet force. Still, she didn't break, because breaking in a room like this is not forgiven. It is punished. Her fingers tightened slightly again, hidden within the folds of her dress. Her nails pressed gently into her skin, grounding her in something real, something she could feel, because everything else felt distant, unreal. The officiant's voice continued, guiding the ceremony forward. The moment was approaching, the one that would finalize everything, the one that would remove whatever remained of choice. Elena knew it. Everyone did. And still, no one saw her. Not truly. Her eyes lifted once more, scanning the room again, but this time something shifted. Not in environment, in perception, because awareness, once it sharpens, begins to notice things differently. The crowd remained the same. The setting remained the same. The illusion remained perfect. But something felt different. A presence. Not loud, not obvious, but there, watching, not casually, not socially, intentionally. Elena's gaze slowed, focused, and for a brief moment, it paused, not on someone familiar, not on someone expected, but on someone unexpected. A man stood further back, slightly removed from the center of attention, yet not hidden. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. His presence didn't demand attention. It commanded it, not through movement, through stillness. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't interacting. He wasn't reacting like the others. He was observing, and not the event. Her. Elena's breath caught for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but real, because there was something different about the way he looked at her. Not admiration, not approval, not curiosity. Understanding. Clear, unfiltered, dangerous. Her eyes shifted away quickly, the reaction instinctive, because being seen, truly seen, was unfamiliar. And unfamiliar is unpredictable. Her composure returned instantly, the smile settling back into place as if nothing had happened. But something had, because now she knew someone had noticed, not the dress, not the performance, not the illusion. Her, the real her, hidden beneath everything. Her heart beat slightly faster, controlled, but no longer perfectly steady, because awareness creates possibility, and possibility is dangerous. The ceremony continued. The voices, the movement, the structure, everything remained intact. But for Elena, nothing felt the same anymore, because the illusion had cracked, not visibly, but internally. And once that happens, it cannot be undone. She didn't look back at him again. Not immediately, because she didn't need to. She could feel it. That presence, that attention, unwavering, unshaken, watching, waiting, understanding more than he should. And that changed everything. Because for the first time that day, Elena Carter felt something different. Not fear, not acceptance. Something sharper. Awareness. And awareness leads to change. Even in places where change is not allowed. Her smile remained perfect. Her posture remained flawless. The ceremony moved forward exactly as planned. To everyone else, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. And just when she thought no one noticed, someone powerful was watching her closely. Everyone saw a bride, but he saw a prisoner. The shift from illusion to awareness did not disappear. It deepened. What Elena Carter had felt moments ago, the subtle, undeniable presence watching her, did not fade into the background like everything else in that carefully constructed room. It remained, steady, focused, unmoving, because the man observing her was not part of the illusion. He existed outside of it. Adrian Volkov did not attend events like this for celebration. He attended for alignment. Power recognized power, and gatherings like this were not about love or tradition. They were about influence, territory, and silent negotiations that shaped decisions long before words were ever spoken. Every guest in that room represented something: wealth, authority, connection. But Adrian represented something else entirely: control. He stood slightly removed from the center of the ballroom, positioned where he could see everything without being seen too closely in return. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. Every movement around him was registered, processed, understood, because observation was his advantage. His presence did not demand attention. It commanded it. Tall, composed, dressed in a sharply tailored black suit that reflected precision rather than style, Adrian carried himself with the kind of stillness that made others instinctively cautious. Not because he appeared threatening in an obvious way, but because nothing about him was careless. Everything was measured. Everything was intentional. His expression remained neutral, almost detached, as if the entire event unfolding before him held no real importance. And in many ways, it didn't, because he had seen versions of this before. Perfect settings hiding imperfect truths. Power disguised as celebration. Control masked as commitment. The details changed. The structure never did. That was why his attention had not been drawn to the decorations, the guests, or the ceremony itself. It had been drawn to her, Elena Carter, not because she stood at the center of the room, but because she did not belong in the version of reality being presented. Most people would not have noticed it, because most people were not looking for it. They saw elegance. He saw restriction. They saw composure. He saw discipline. They saw a bride. He saw someone holding herself together with precision that did not come from confidence, but from necessity. That was the intellectual hook. Because understanding the difference between natural behavior and controlled behavior is what separates awareness from ignorance. Adrian's gaze had settled on her the moment he entered the room, not with curiosity, but with recognition. The kind that comes from experience, from years of observing people in environments where truth is rarely spoken, but always present beneath the surface. She was not reacting like someone in control of her situation. She was reacting like someone managing it. There was a difference, a critical one. Her posture was too precise, her movements too measured, her expressions too consistent. Nothing about her behavior was accidental, and that meant one thing. It had been learned, conditioned, refined over time, because people who are free do not control themselves that carefully. They don't need to. Adrian's gaze remained steady, his attention fixed not on what she showed, but on what she concealed. The slight tension in her shoulders when the room grew too quiet. The almost imperceptible pause before she responded to cues. The way her breathing shifted, subtly, when certain names were mentioned. Details no one else noticed. Details no one else cared to notice, because they were too focused on the performance. But Adrian did not watch performances. He studied patterns. And patterns never lie. Around him, the room continued as expected. Conversations flowed. Glasses clinked softly. Quiet laughter filled the spaces between formal structure. The illusion remained intact, But for Adrian, the illusion had already broken, because once you see the truth, you cannot return to ignorance. His attention shifted briefly to the man standing beside her, Daniel Hayes. Adrian recognized the name before the introduction had even been made earlier that evening. Influence, corporate reach, strategic positioning within circles that value control over transparency. A man who built power quietly. A man who maintained it through structure. But there was something else, something beneath the surface. Adrian watched the interaction between them. Not what was said, but how it was said. The distance, the lack of natural connection, the absence of even the smallest, unconscious gestures that define human familiarity. No shared awareness, no mutual presence, only alignment, strategic, calculated, empty, and that confirmed everything. This was not a union. It was an arrangement, and Elena was part of it, not by choice, by design. Adrian's gaze returned to her, sharper now, more focused, because once a pattern is identified, it becomes impossible to ignore. Her smile remained unchanged, flawless in its execution, but he wasn't looking at the smile. He was watching her eyes, because eyes are harder to control, and what he saw there was not joy, not anticipation, not even fear in its raw form. It was containment, the kind that exists when emotion is not allowed to surface, when reaction is not permitted, when expression is managed, because the consequences of failing to manage it are severe. Adrian's expression did not shift, but his understanding did, because this was no longer casual observation. This was recognition of a system, a familiar one, control through expectation, pressure through structure, silence through consequence. He had seen it before. He had dismantled it before, but never in a setting this public, this exposed, this carefully disguised. His presence remained still, but his attention sharpened further. The room around him blurred, not physically, but in relevance. Conversations became noise. Movement became background, because the only thing that mattered now was her, not who she was, but what she represented, and more importantly, what she was trying to hide. The ceremony moved forward, guided by timing and expectation. Every step followed a script. Every moment aligned with what the guests anticipated. But Adrian did not follow scripts. He analyzed deviations, and she was full of them. Her fingers moved slightly again, a small motion hidden within the folds of her dress. Most would miss it. He didn't, because that movement was not random. It was controlled release, a way to manage pressure without exposing it. Her breathing shifted again, barely visible, but enough to confirm internal strain. Her gaze lowered at specific intervals, not out of modesty, but recalibration. Everything about her was managed, and that meant everything about her situation was not. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, barely noticeable, but real, because this was not just observation anymore. It was understanding, and understanding creates decision points. He did not intervene impulsively. That was not his nature. He calculated. He evaluated. He determined value and consequence before action, always. But something about this did not align with passive observation, because what he was seeing was not just control. It was confinement, hidden, refined, but present. And confinement was something Adrian did not ignore, not when it intersected with his world. His gaze shifted once more across the room, quickly assessing the broader environment, the positioning of her family, the placement of security, the subtle but clear indicators of authority embedded within the structure of the event. Everything was controlled. Everything was accounted for, which meant there were no visible cracks, except one, her, because no system, no matter how perfect, can completely eliminate human truth. It can only suppress it, and suppressed truth always finds a way to surface. Adrian exhaled slowly, his posture unchanged, but his focus now locked with precision, because now this was no longer curiosity. It was intention. The ceremony approached its final phase, the moment where everything would become irreversible, the point where illusion becomes binding reality. And Elena was reaching her limit. He could see it clearly now, not in dramatic expression, but in microfractures, the slight delay in her responses, the increasing tension in her posture, the controlled but weakening consistency in her breathing. She was holding on, but not for much longer. And then it happened, small, almost invisible. Her hand trembled, not enough for the room to notice, not enough for the officiant to pause, not enough for the guests to react, but enough for someone who was already watching. Adrian's gaze sharpened instantly, because that was the break in pattern, the moment where control slips and truth appears. It lasted less than a second, but it was real, and it confirmed everything. She was not just uncomfortable. She was trapped. The realization settled with cold clarity, because now there was no uncertainty left, no doubt, no assumption, only fact. Adrian did not look away, did not hesitate, did not reconsider, because moments like that define decisions, and decisions define outcomes. The room continued as if nothing had happened. The ceremony moved forward. The illusion remained perfect, but Adrian Volkov had already stepped beyond it, because once he recognized the truth, he could not ignore it. And more importantly, he would not. His thoughts aligned quickly, precisely, without wasted motion, because this was not about emotion. It was about control, and control was about to shift. His posture remained still, his expression unchanged, but internally, the decision had already been made, because when her hand trembled, he made a decision that could change everything. In a room full of people, one small action broke all the rules. The fracture that began as a tremor did not disappear. It expanded. Elena Carter remained standing at the center of a moment that was no longer stable, even if the world around her continued as though nothing had shifted. The ceremony advanced with perfect timing, each word spoken by the officiant falling into place like part of a script that had been rehearsed long before she ever stepped into that room. But something inside her was no longer following the script. The pressure that had been building beneath her calm exterior had reached a point where control was no longer effortless. It required effort now. Focus, precision. Every second demanded more from her than the last. And that was the beginning of collapse. Her breathing remained measured, but it was no longer natural. Each inhale felt slightly restricted, each exhale slightly forced. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough for her to feel. And that was worse, because when control starts to feel heavy, it becomes harder to maintain. The room remained perfect. The guests remained unaware. The illusion remained intact. But Elena's world had narrowed. The voices blurred into distant sound. The faces around her lost definition. Even the man standing beside her, Daniel Hayes, became less of a presence and more of a fixed point in a reality she could no longer fully engage with, because something inside her was resisting, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. Her fingers tightened again, this time slightly more than before. The fabric of her dress shifted subtly under the pressure, the only physical evidence of what she was holding back. Emotion, fear, something deeper, something she had spent years learning to suppress, because suppression had always been survival, but survival has limits, and she was reaching them. The officiant's voice shifted tone, signaling the approach of the final exchange, the moment where everything would be sealed, where appearance would become reality, and reality would no longer allow escape. Elena knew it, her body knew it, and for the first time, her control began to slip. Her vision blurred, not dramatically, not enough to cause visible disruption, but enough to distort the sharp perfection of the room around her. The lights felt brighter, the air felt thinner, her chest tightened further, and then something broke, not visibly, not completely, but internally. A crack, a moment where everything she had been holding in pressed too hard against the structure she had built to contain it. Her hand moved slightly again, this time not fully controlled. A tremor, small, but real, and this time it didn't stop immediately. That was the moment, the critical point where control no longer masked truth completely, where the illusion became fragile, and across the room. Adrian Volkov saw it. He did not hesitate, because hesitation belongs to people who need time to decide. Adrian did not. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived, the moment where observation becomes action, the moment where understanding demands interruption. His posture shifted, not dramatically, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to change direction, because movement in a room built on control is never neutral. Every step carries meaning, and Adrian's steps were intentional. He moved forward, calm, measured, unstoppable. At first, no one noticed, because no one expected disruption. This was a controlled environment, a structured event, a place where everything followed order. But Adrian was not part of that order, and as he moved closer, the space around him responded. Subtly, people shifted, not consciously, instinctively, because presence like his does not need announcement. It creates its own path. Elena did not see him approach immediately. Her focus was inward now, fighting to maintain the control she perfected over years. The tremor in her hand had stopped, but the pressure behind it remained stronger than before, because once control breaks, even slightly, it becomes harder to rebuild. The officiant's voice continued, guiding the moment toward its inevitable conclusion. "Do you?" The words blended, distant, unclear, because Elena was no longer fully present in the room. She was standing in it, but she was not part of it. And that was when Adrian stepped into her world. He didn't speak. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't ask for permission, because permission was irrelevant. What mattered was interruption. His hand reached out, steady, certain, and without hesitation. He took hers. The contact was immediate, unexpected, unavoidable, and everything stopped, not physically. The room didn't freeze. The ceremony didn't collapse instantly, but something deeper shifted, because that single action broke the structure. Elena felt it before she understood it. The warmth, the firmness, the undeniable presence of someone else's control, intersecting with her own. Her body reacted instinctively, her gaze snapping toward the source of the contact. And for the first time, she saw him clearly. Adrian Volkov, not as a distant presence, not as a watcher, but as someone standing directly inside her moment, inside her reality, inside something that no one had ever stepped into before. Her breath caught, not from fear, from shock, because this was impossible. No one interrupted something like this. No one challenged a structure this controlled. No one crossed that line. And yet, he had. The room began to react. Not loudly, not immediately, but visibly. Guests turned. Whispers formed. Movement slowed. Because something had happened. Something that did not belong. Daniel Hayes' posture shifted beside her. Subtle, but sharp. His attention moved toward Adrian, his expression tightening. Not in confusion, but in controlled anger. Because he understood. This was not a mistake. This was a challenge. Elena's family reacted differently. Shock first, then calculation. Because situations like this were not emotional. They were strategic. And this was a disruption. Adrian did not release her hand. His grip remained steady, not forceful, not gentle. Controlled, intentional. Because this was not comfort. It was declaration. The emotional hook was not the touch itself. It was what the touch meant. Because in a world built on silent rules, breaking one rule questions all of them. Elena felt it fully now. Not just the physical contact, but the shift. Something had changed. Inside her, around her. The pressure that had been suffocating her moments ago eased. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to think. Because for the first time, she was not holding herself together alone. Adrian's gaze met hers. Steady, unmoving, not asking, not questioning, understanding. That same understanding she had felt earlier, but stronger now, closer, impossible to ignore. And in that moment, Elena realized something. He wasn't saving her. He wasn't rescuing her. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was exposing the truth. The illusion had cracked. Now, it was breaking. The officiant had stopped speaking, not by choice, by disruption, because the moment no longer belonged to the script. It belonged to something else, something uncontrolled. Daniel's voice didn't rise, because men like him do not lose control publicly, but his presence shifted, sharpened, dangerous, because this was not acceptable. This was interference. Elena could feel the tension building rapidly now, the room tightening, the structure destabilizing, all because of one action, one movement, one decision. Adrian did not look away, did not release her, did not step back, because stepping back would restore control, and that was no longer the objective. His voice did not fill the room, but his silence did, because silence, when intentional, is louder than words. Elena's hand remained in his, not pulling away, not resisting, because something inside her had shifted. The part of her that had been suppressing everything had found something else to hold on to, not safety, not certainty, but possibility. And possibility is more dangerous than fear. The room had changed completely now, not visibly destroyed, but internally altered, because everyone present understood one thing. This was no longer a wedding. This was a statement, a challenge, a shift in power. Daniel's gaze hardened further, his attention locked onto Adrian with controlled intensity, because this moment had crossed into something else, something that would not be ignored, something that would not be forgotten. Elena felt it too, the weight of what had just happened, the consequences, the irreversible nature of it, because actions like this do not disappear. They expand, they escalate, they create outcomes. Her breathing steadied slightly, but not from control, from awareness, because now she understood this moment was not small. It was not temporary. It was not something that would fade. It was the beginning of something larger, something dangerous, something unstoppable. Adrian's grip remained unchanged, his presence unwavering, because he knew exactly what he had done. And more importantly, he knew what it would lead to. The room waited, not for resolution, for reaction, because reaction determines escalation, and escalation determines everything that follows. Elena's final realization settled with quiet clarity, because now there was no going back, no returning to the illusion, no pretending this had not happened, because it had, and it had changed everything. That one move turned a peaceful wedding into a silent war. He didn't just interrupt a wedding. He challenged powerful people. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. What had begun as a controlled, elegant ceremony had now shifted into something far more dangerous. Something unspoken, but clearly understood by every person in the room who mattered. The disruption Adrian Volkov had introduced was not a mistake, nor was it an emotional reaction. It was a calculated interference. And in a world built on silent agreements and unspoken boundaries, interference was never ignored. Elena Carter remained still, her hand still held in Adrian's, but her awareness now expanding beyond her own internal struggle. The moment had pulled her out of herself and placed her directly into something larger, something she did not fully understand, but could feel, because the atmosphere had changed. Completely. The guests no longer looked at the ceremony with admiration. They watched with caution. Whispers moved through the room like controlled currents, quiet but persistent. Eyes shifted, postures adjusted. Conversations stopped mid-thought, because people like them recognized tension when it appeared. And this tension was not ordinary. It carried consequence. Daniel Hayes did not move immediately, but his stillness was not calm. It was controlled restraint. His posture remained straight, his expression composed, but beneath that composure lay something far sharper, something dangerous. The kind of anger that did not explode outward, but instead condensed inward, becoming more precise, more focused, because men like Daniel did not react emotionally. They responded strategically, his gaze locked onto Adrian's hand, the one still holding Elena's, with a focus that did not need words to communicate meaning. It was not confusion. It was recognition. Recognition of a boundary crossed, recognition of a challenge issued, recognition of a situation that had just escalated beyond control. But Adrian did not release her. He did not acknowledge Daniel directly. He did not shift, step back, or attempt to soften what he had done, because softening would suggest uncertainty. And Adrian Volkov was never uncertain. His posture remained exactly as it had been, calm, balanced, unaffected by the shifting atmosphere around him. The room could react however it wanted. It did not change his position. That was the intellectual hook. Because true power is not shown through force. It is shown through stillness, when everything else begins to move. Elena felt it clearly now. The contrast. Daniel's presence, tight, controlled, reactive. Adrian's presence, steady, deliberate, unshaken. And between them, she stood at the center of something that was no longer about her alone. This was no longer just her wedding. It was becoming a confrontation. Her fingers, still in Adrian's grasp, no longer trembled the way they had moments ago. Not because the situation had become safer, but because something inside her had shifted. The pressure that had been crushing her earlier had changed form. It was still there, but it was no longer isolating her. Now, it was surrounding her, shared, distributed across the room in the form of tension, awareness, and silent calculation. She didn't pull her hand away, not immediately, not instinctively, because something deeper held her in place. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Recognition that this moment was no longer under her control. And strangely, that gave her a kind of clarity. Daniel finally moved, slowly, deliberately. His gaze lifted from their hands to Adrian's face. And for the first time, the room felt the full weight of his attention, because now the confrontation had become direct. "You're out of place." The words were not loud, but they didn't need to be. They were precise, measured, designed to establish order, to restore control. But Adrian did not respond immediately, because response is given when necessary. And nothing about this moment required urgency. Instead, he looked at Daniel, not as an opponent, not as an equal, but as a variable, something to be assessed, something to be understood, and then handled. His grip on Elena's hand did not tighten. It did not loosen. It remained exactly the same, because consistency is what defines intention. The room held its breath, not literally, but collectively, because everyone understood this was not a normal exchange. This was power meeting power, and power never interacts without consequence. Elena's gaze moved between them, her awareness sharpening with every passing second. The confusion she had felt moments ago had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something more structured, because now she could see it, the dynamics, the control, the layers of influence that had always existed around her, but had never been this visible. Daniel represented expectation. Adrian represented disruption, and she stood between them, not as a person, but as a point where those two forces collided. That realization settled heavily, because it meant this moment was not about emotion, it was about power. Her family reacted next, not loudly, not dramatically, but with calculated movement. Her father stepped forward slightly, his expression composed, but his eyes sharp with silent warning. He did not speak immediately, because speaking too soon can reveal position, and position, in moments like this, is everything. The guests watched carefully now, no longer pretending, no longer ignoring, because the illusion had fully broken. Adrian finally spoke. His voice was calm, even, untouched by the tension surrounding him. "She's not comfortable." Simple words, but heavy, because they acknowledged something that the entire room had been ignoring. Truth. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, because truth, when exposed publicly, becomes a problem. "She doesn't need your concern." Again controlled, again precise, but beneath it, clear authority. Adrian's gaze did not shift. "That's not your decision." That line, that single line, cut deeper than anything else, because it didn't just challenge behavior, it challenged ownership. And ownership, in a room like this, is everything. The tension spiked, sharply, visibly, because now this was no longer subtle. This was direct conflict. Elena felt it fully. The weight, the pressure, the consequences forming in real time. But something else, something unexpected, rose alongside it. Awareness, because for the first time, someone had spoken what she could not asked, not hinted, stated, and that changed everything. The emotional hook was not the conflict itself. It was what the conflict revealed. Because when someone challenges control publicly, it exposes who truly holds power and who only pretends to. Daniel took a step closer, not aggressive, but intentional. You're interfering in something that doesn't concern you. The statement was clear, final, a boundary. But Adrian did not step back. He did not adjust. He did not acknowledge the boundary, because boundaries only exist when both sides accept them. And Adrian did not. The room understood it now. This was not going to resolve quietly. This was not going to be smoothed over, because both men stood in their positions completely, unmoved, unwilling to yield. Elena's breathing steadied again, but not from calm, from clarity, because now she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. The situation was never about her happiness. It was about control. And now, control was being questioned. Her gaze lowered briefly, then lifted again, stronger, more aware, because now she was not just reacting. She was seeing the structure, the expectations, the silent rules that had shaped her life, and how easily one action had begun to break them. The guests remained silent, but their attention spoke loudly, because everyone present knew this moment would not disappear. It would spread through conversations, through alliances, through decisions made after this room emptied, because power, once challenged, demands response. Adrienne finally released her hand, not as retreat, as transition, because the point had already been made. The line had already been crossed. The disruption had already begun. Elena felt the absence immediately, but not as loss, as shift, because what had just happened could not be undone. Daniel's gaze followed the movement, his expression tightening further, because now this was no longer just interference. It was declaration, and declarations lead to consequences. Elena remained still, but internally everything had changed, because now she understood this moment was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The room slowly began to move again, but the tension did not leave. It settled, deeper, heavier, because now everyone was waiting for what came next. And what came next would not be simple, because actions like this do not fade. They escalate. They evolve. They create conflict that cannot be ignored. And as the weight of everything settled into place, one final truth became undeniable. Protecting her would mean going against people who never forgive. Her tears weren't weakness. They were proof of something darker. The tension left behind by the confrontation did not disappear. It settled deeper than before. What had once been hidden beneath polished smiles and controlled movements was now exposed, not fully, not openly, but enough to change the structure of everything surrounding Elena Carter. The wedding had not ended, not officially. The ceremony still existed. The guests still lingered. The illusion still attempted to repair itself. But something fundamental had broken, and once broken, it could not return to what had been. Elena stood at the center of that fracture, no longer just a participant in a carefully arranged moment, but a point of consequence. The way it would have just happened had not faded. It pressed against her awareness, forcing her to confront something she had spent years avoiding. The truth, not the version presented to the world. The real one, the one buried beneath expectation, obligation, and control. Her breathing had steadied, but not from calm. It had steadied because her mind had shifted. The confusion that once clouded her understanding had begun to clear, replaced by something sharper, recognition. Because Adrian Volkov's interference had done more than disrupt the ceremony. It had exposed something she could no longer ignore. that she had never had a choice. Not truly. Her gaze lowered slightly, not in submission, but in reflection, because now, with the illusion fractured, her past no longer felt distant. It moved forward, aligning itself with the present, forming a pattern that was impossible to deny. Elena Carter had not arrived at this moment by coincidence. She had been placed here, carefully, deliberately, for a purpose that had nothing to do with her happiness. Her family had always spoken of responsibility, of legacy, of maintaining position in a world where influence determined survival. But responsibility in their world did not mean freedom. It meant obedience. Her childhood had not been cruel in the obvious sense. There had been no chaos, no visible neglect. Everything had been structured, provided, controlled, too controlled. Decisions had always been made around her, for her, what she studied, where she went, who she interacted with. Each step guided not by her desires, but by calculated outcomes, because she was not being raised as an individual. She was being prepared as an asset. That was the intellectual hook, because the most dangerous form of control is not force. It is conditioning so complete that the person being controlled begins to believe it is normal. Elena had believed it for years, until moments began to appear, small ones at first, where something inside her questioned the structure. Why certain choices were never hers. Why every path seemed already decided. Why her voice never carried weight. But questioning did not lead to change. It led to correction, subtle at first, then firmer, until questioning itself became something she learned to suppress, because resistance, in her world, was not tolerated. And then Daniel Hayes entered the picture, not suddenly, not unexpectedly, gradually, introduced as opportunity, as alignment, as something beneficial for both families. The language had always been the same, carefully chosen, emotionally neutral, because this was not about love. It was about expansion, power, control. Daniel had never pretended to be anything else. That was what made him more dangerous. He did not manipulate with charm. He controlled with expectation. From the beginning, his presence carried something cold, not aggressive, not visibly threatening, but firm in a way that left no room for interpretation. What he wanted was understood, without needing to be spoken, and what he expected was compliance. Elena had seen it early, recognized it, but recognition does not equal escape, because by then, the decision had already been made, not by her, never by her. The engagement had been presented as inevitability, not possibility, and once announced, it became structure, a structure reinforced by her family's approval, their insistence that this was the right step, the necessary step, the only step that ensured stability, for them, not for her. Elena had not refused, because refusal was never truly an option, and that was the emotional hook, because sometimes people do not stay silent because they are weak. They stay silent because they understand the cost of speaking, and that cost was something Elena had learned to measure carefully. The days leading to the wedding had been filled with preparation, not emotional preparation, strategic preparation, appearances, behavior, expectations. Every detail rehearsed, refined, controlled, not to make her comfortable, but to make her convincing. And she had done it perfectly, because survival had always depended on it. Back in the present, Elena's gaze lifted slightly, her awareness returning fully to the room around her. But now, she was seeing it differently, not as a space she belonged in, as a structure she had been placed inside. Her family's expressions, once sources of authority, now appeared calculated. Daniel's presence, once something she endured, now revealed its full weight, control, everywhere, layered, hidden beneath formality, but visible now, completely. Adrian stood at a distance again, his posture unchanged, but his attention still present. He did not need to move closer, because he had already done what mattered. He had broken the illusion, and now the truth was surfacing on its own. He observed her carefully, not as someone fragile, but as someone revealing something important, because her reactions were no longer concealed. They were aligning, And through that alignment, he understood everything. Her silence was not passive. It was enforced. Her composure was not natural. It was trained. Her tears were not emotional weakness. They were evidence of pressure, of control, of something far deeper than discomfort, something systematic. Adrian's gaze shifted briefly toward Daniel, then toward her family. And in that moment, the entire structure became clear. This was not just a marriage. It was an agreement, a consolidation of power. And Elena was a connecting piece, not value for herself, but for what she enabled. And that made her both important and expendable. His jaw tightened slightly, because situations like this did not remain contained. They escalated, especially when disrupted. And this had been disrupted deliberately. The room had not returned to normal. It had adapted, but the tension remained embedded within it, because everyone present understood this situation had changed, and change creates consequences. Elena exhaled slowly, her posture no longer as rigid as before, but not relaxed either. Something within her had shifted permanently, because now she saw it, all of it, the past, the present, the structure that had shaped her life, and the truth that she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She had never been free, not in her choices, not in her future, not even in this moment. But now, that truth was no longer hidden, and once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. Her gaze moved once more, briefly landing on Adrian, and in that moment, another realization formed. He knew not every detail, not every memory, but enough to understand the situation, enough to see the system, enough to recognize what she had been forced into, and that made him dangerous, because people who understand systems can break them, but breaking systems comes with cost, high cost, because systems like this do not collapse quietly. They retaliate, they defend, they eliminate threats, and now he had become one. Elena's final thought settled with heavy clarity, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. This was not just about her. Not anymore. This was about power, control, and what happens when control is challenged. Saving her wouldn't just break a marriage, it would start a war. This was never about love. It was about power. The shift from truth to consequence did not take time. It was immediate, invisible to most, but absolute for those who understood how power moved beneath the surface. Elena Carter's realization had not remained contained within her. It had already begun to ripple outward, because truth, once exposed, does not stay quiet. It forces reaction, and reaction creates conflict. The wedding, though still intact in appearance, had transformed into something else entirely. What once functioned as a celebration now existed as a controlled environment, filled with calculated observation. Every movement, every glance, every silence carried meaning. Nothing was neutral anymore, because the balance had been disturbed. Adrian Volkov did not move recklessly. He did not escalate visibly. That was not how men like him operated. Instead, he adjusted the structure around him, quietly, precisely, because real war does not begin with noise. It begins with positioning. From the outside, nothing had changed. The venue still held its elegance. The guests still maintained their composure. Conversations continued in measured tones, and appearances remained carefully preserved. But beneath that surface, systems had already begun to collide. Political influence, corporate alliances, criminal networks, all intersecting in one place, and now pulling in different directions. That was the intellectual hook, because power does not fight loudly when it is strong. It fights silently until control is threatened, and control was now under pressure. Adrian's presence had altered the equation, not through force, through awareness, by recognizing what others had chosen to ignore, by stepping into a moment where no one else would. And that action had consequences, immediate ones. Daniel Hayes had not reacted publicly. He had not raised his voice. He had not allowed the situation to break the image he was maintaining. But internally, everything had shifted because control had been interrupted, and interruption is never tolerated by those who rely on dominance. His gaze followed Elena now in a way that was no longer passive. It was measured, calculated, and edged with something sharper than before. Possession, because in his world, she was not an individual. She was part of an agreement, and agreements are enforced, not questioned. Elena felt it, not because he spoke, but because she had lived under that kind of control long enough to recognize its presence without needing words. The shift in his attention, the tightening of his posture, the silent recalibration of his behavior, it all pointed to one truth. He was no longer maintaining the illusion. He was preparing for correction. And correction, in systems like his, is never gentle. Across the room, her family had also adjusted. Subtly, but noticeably, their expressions remained composed, but their focus had sharpened. Conversations shortened. Movements became more deliberate, because they understood something critical. The situation was no longer stable. Their carefully constructed arrangement had been disrupted, and disruption threatens everything built on control. Elena stood within that tension, no longer shielded by ignorance, no longer softened by denial. She understood now, fully, what this moment represented. Not a personal conflict, not an emotional situation, a power struggle, one that had nothing to do with her feelings, and everything to do with what she represented. Adrian observed all of it, without reacting, without rushing, because reaction would expose intention, and intention had to remain controlled. His role was not to create chaos. It was to manage it. From within, he moved subtly through the space, his presence steady, his awareness sharp. His men had already begun positioning themselves without drawing attention, not aggressively, not visibly, strategically, because protection, in environments like this, must be invisible to be effective. Eyes that did not appear to watch were watching. Movements that seemed natural were calculated. Every entrance, every exit, every shift in energy tracked, because now Elena was no longer just part of the event. She was a target, not publicly, not yet, but inevitably. And Adrian understood something clearly. Targets attract action, even when that action is delayed. The threats did not arrive loudly. They never do. They began as subtle changes. A delay in communication, a shift in security presence, an unusual pause in interactions that should have remained consistent. Small details. But in systems like these, small details signal large movements. They've noticed, one of Adrian's men reported quietly. The words were minimal, but the meaning was not. Adrian did not turn. Of course they have, because awareness creates counter-awareness. And now, both sides were watching each other. The conflict had begun, not openly, but actively. Elena felt it in ways that could not be explained. The environment had changed. The air felt heavier. The space felt smaller, not physically, psychologically, because pressure was building, and she was at the center of it. Her breathing remained steady, but not from calm, from control, because she had learned long ago that showing instability invites domination, but control does not eliminate danger. It only delays reaction. She moved slightly, adjusting her position within the space. Her awareness no longer focused on appearance, but on movement. Who was watching, who was waiting, who was preparing, and the realization came quickly. There was no safe direction, because safety was never part of the system, only power, and power always demands control. Adrian's presence remained constant, not intrusive, not distant, calculated, because his role had already shifted. He was no longer just observing. He was protecting, but not in the way most would understand. Not with comfort, not with reassurance, with structure, with positioning, with silent resistance against a system that had already begun to push back. That was the emotional hook, because true protection does not feel safe. It feels controlled. It feels strategic. It feels like standing in the middle of danger with someone who understands it better than anyone else. Elena's gaze briefly met his, and in that moment, another realization formed. He knew what was coming. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand the pattern. Enough to anticipate movement. Enough to prepare. And that was the only reason she was still standing without collapse. Because without that, this environment would have already consumed her. Across the room, Daniel shifted slightly. A small movement, but deliberate. His attention moved away from appearances and toward something else entirely. Control recovery. Because the moment he lost control was the moment he began working to regain it. And people like him always regain it. Through pressure, through influence, through force. If necessary, Adrian noticed. Of course he did. And his response was immediate, not outwardly. Internally, his men adjusted, positions shifted, invisible lines drawn. Because now, this was no longer observation. This was engagement. The war had not been announced, but it had begun. Silently, strategically, relentlessly. Elena felt it fully now. The weight, the pressure, the inevitability. Her presence here was no longer passive. It was active. She was no longer just involved. She was central, and being central meant one thing. She would be targeted. Her voice did not come. Her expression did not change. But her understanding solidified. There was no returning to what this was supposed to be, no repairing the illusion, no stepping back into ignorance. This had crossed into something else, something dangerous, something irreversible. Adrian's final calculation settled with precise clarity, because now there were only two outcomes, control or conflict, and control was no longer shared. It was contested. The space around them remained composed on the surface, but beneath it, everything had shifted, lines drawn, sides formed, intentions sharpened, because power, when challenged, does not retreat, it responds. And as that realization settled fully into the structure of everything unfolding, one final truth became unavoidable. The place meant to protect her was becoming the most dangerous. The man she feared became the only one she could rely on. The war had already begun, not with explosions or visible destruction, but with silent positioning, controlled movements, and decisions that carried consequences far beyond what anyone in that room could openly acknowledge. Elena Carter stood inside that reality now, fully aware, fully exposed. The illusion of safety had been stripped away in the previous moments. The wedding was no longer a place of protection, nor was it a place she could hide behind appearances. It had transformed into a controlled battlefield, one where power, influence, and silent threats moved beneath every interaction. And in the center of it stood her. But something else had changed. Not the danger, not the pressure, her perspective. Because fear, when it reaches its limit, either breaks a person or reshapes them. Elena was no longer reacting the same way. Her breathing was steady, not because she felt safe, but because she had begun to understand the structure around her. The invisible lines, the unspoken signals, the quiet shifts in control. She could see them now, and more importantly, she could see him. Adrian Volkov. He had not moved dramatically. He had not made any grand statements. He had not tried to comfort her or convince her of anything. But everything around her had adjusted because of him. Security had shifted. Attention had redirected. Pressure had been managed, not removed. Managed. That distinction was everything, because it revealed something critical. He was not protecting her emotionally. He was protecting her strategically. And strategy was something she understood. That was the intellectual hook. Because trust is not always built on kindness. Sometimes it is built on competence, on consistency, on someone proving, again and again, that they understand danger better than anyone else in the room. Elena's gaze moved subtly across the space again, but this time with a different purpose. She was no longer searching for escape routes. She was observing patterns, where people stood, who watched whom, where tension gathered. And every time she traced those invisible lines, they led back to one place. Adrian, not because he was controlling everything openly, but because nothing moved around him without reason. He was not reacting to the war. He was shaping it. That realization settled deeply, because it forced her to confront something she had been avoiding. Fear had kept her alive, but fear was no longer enough. Not here. Not now. Across the room, Daniel Hayes remained composed, but his attention had sharpened into something far more dangerous than before. He was no longer playing the role of groom. He was recalibrating control. And Elena knew exactly what that meant. Correction was coming. Not publicly, not immediately, but inevitably. Her fingers tightened slightly at her side, not from panic, but from recognition, because she had lived inside that system long enough to understand its next move. And for the first time, she did not feel alone inside that understanding. Adrian stepped slightly closer. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to disrupt the environment, but enough to shift the dynamic between them. He did not speak. He did not need to, because presence can communicate more than words ever could. Elena did not flinch. That alone was a change, because before, his proximity had felt like another form of danger. Now, it felt like something else. Not safety, not comfort, but stability, a fixed point inside a shifting system. And stability is the first step toward trust. She studied him briefly, her expression controlled, her thoughts precise. He was still dangerous. That had not changed. His calm was not softness. His silence was not emptiness. Everything about him still carried weight, still carried threat, but it was a different kind of threat, one that was directed outward, not at her. That distinction changed everything, because fear is not removed when danger disappears. It is replaced when danger becomes aligned with you instead of against you. Elena understood that now, not emotionally, logically. Her posture shifted slightly, more grounded, more deliberate, because now she was making a decision, not out of desperation, not out of weakness, out of clarity. She could not return to what she had been before. That version of herself, the one who complied, who endured, who remained silent, no longer existed. The system she came from had already lost control over her, and the system she stood in now required something else entirely. Awareness, positioning, choice. Her gaze met Adrian's again. This time, not with fear, with understanding. And that was the emotional hook. Because trust does not begin with comfort. It begins with recognition. Recognizing that someone sees the same reality you do, understands the same dangers, operates under the same truths. Even if their methods are different, even if their world is darker, even if trusting them comes with risk. Adrian held her gaze for a moment longer. He did not ask for trust. He did not expect it, because trust, in his world, was never given freely. It was earned through action, through consistency, through survival. And Elena was beginning to see that. A subtle movement across the room drew her attention again. One of Daniel's men, not approaching, not confronting, positioning, testing proximity, measuring response. Adrian noticed immediately. Of course he did. His reaction was minimal, a slight shift in stance, a nearly invisible signal. And within seconds, the space adjusted again. Barriers that did not look like barriers formed. Distances that did not seem intentional became controlled. The man did not move closer. He stopped, redirected, withdrawn. No confrontation, no escalation, just prevention. Clean, efficient, undeniable. Elena saw it clearly, because now she was watching for it. And that moment, that single controlled action, did more than any words could. It proved something. He did not need to explain protection. He executed it, without attention, without recognition, without expectation. And that is what trust builds on. Her breath steadied further, not because the danger had lessened, but because her understanding had deepened. She was not navigating this alone. Not anymore. That realization settled quietly, but powerfully, because it changed her position completely. She was no longer isolated inside a system designed to control her. She was aligned with someone who could challenge it, even if that someone was dangerous, even if that alignment came with consequences. her thoughts sharpened further, because now she was no longer deciding whether to trust him. She was deciding how far that trust could go. And that question was far more dangerous, because trust, once given, cannot be taken back easily. It binds, it connects, it pulls you deeper into whatever system you are aligning with. And Adrian's world was not simple, not clean, not safe. It was built on power, on control, on decisions that did not allow weakness. And stepping into that world meant becoming part of it, fully, irreversibly. Elena understood that, completely, which meant her decision was not small. It was not temporary. It was transformative. Her voice did not come, but her actions did. She did not step away from him. She did not create distance. She did not retreat back into isolation. Instead, she remained where she was, aligned, present, aware, and that was a decision. Adrian recognized it immediately, because in his world, actions mattered more than words. And staying was the clearest action of all. The space between them settled into something new, not uncertain, not fragile, defined, because now there was an understanding, unspoken, but absolute. They were no longer operating separately. They were operating together, strategically, deliberately, dangerously. Across the room, Daniel's attention sharpened further, because he saw it too, not the details, not the structure, but the shift, the alignment. And alignment is what threatens control the most, because it creates resistance, and resistance creates conflict. The tension increased again, subtly but undeniably, because now this was no longer just a disrupted situation. It was a divided one. Sides had formed. Lines had been drawn, even if no one acknowledged them openly. And once lines are drawn, they are eventually crossed. Elena felt it, the inevitability, the weight of what she had just chosen, because trusting Adrian did not remove danger. It redefined it. It shifted it. It pulled her deeper into something far more complex than what she had escaped. But for the first time, she was not afraid of that complexity, because now she had something she did not have before. Control. Not full, not absolute, but enough. Enough to stand. Enough to choose. Enough to stop running. Her final realization settled with quiet clarity, because now she understood the cost. Trusting him could protect her. It could give her a position inside this war. It could allow her to fight back against a system that had controlled her for so long. But it would also do something else. It would pull her deeper into his world, a world where power was constant, where control was everything, where danger never truly left. And as that realization settled fully, heavier than fear and sharper than instinct, one final truth remained. Trusting him could save her or trap her in a darker world. For the first time, she chose her own future. The shift from trust to decision did not arrive gently. It arrived with clarity. Cold, precise, unavoidable. Elena Carter no longer stood in confusion. She stood in understanding. Everything that had unfolded, the silent war, the shifting power, the controlled tension surrounding her, had led to this exact moment. Not by accident, not by fate alone, but by consequence. Because every system, every structure, every form of control she had lived under had pushed her toward one inevitable truth. She could no longer remain passive. The wedding around her still existed in appearance. The polished floors, the carefully arranged guests, the controlled conversations. Everything remained visually intact, but meaning had already changed. This was no longer a ceremony. It was a stage, a final intersection of power, control, and choice. And Elena stood at the center of it, no longer as a participant, but as a deciding force. That was the intellectual hook, because true power does not come from control over others. It comes from control over oneself. And for the first time, Elena had it. Her posture reflected it. No hesitation, no quiet submission, no hidden fear behind carefully constructed expressions. The girl who had walked into this place no longer existed, because that version of her had been built by others, defined by expectations, shaped by pressure, controlled by systems that never gave it a right to choose. But now, that structure had broken, and what remained was something else entirely. Awareness, clarity, decision. Across the room, the balance continued to shift. Daniel Hayes was no longer maintaining the illusion of calm. His composure remained, but it was no longer neutral. It was controlled tension, because he understood what was happening. Not every detail, not every strategy, but enough to recognize that the situation had moved beyond his control. And that was unacceptable, because control, in his world, was not optional. It was absolute. His gaze fixed on Elena now with sharpened intensity, not as a groom, not as a partner, but as someone observing a variable that had broken from expectation, a deviation, and deviations must be corrected. His family, too, had shifted fully into awareness. Their silence was no longer passive. It was calculated, evaluating, measuring, preparing, because they understood something critical. This was no longer a private matter. This was a public fracture. And fractures spread. Adrian Volkov remained steady beside Elena, unmoved, unshaken, because this was not his moment to act. It was hers. He had already done what he needed to do. He had shifted the system, created space, exposed the truth. Now, the decision belonged to her. And that was the emotional hook. Because real freedom is not given. It is taken. And taking it requires risk. Elena felt the weight of that fully now. Not as pressure, but as clarity. There were no illusions left. No escape routes that led back to safety. No version of this where she could return to what had been arranged for her. That life was gone. And in its place stood a choice. Stay, submit, return to control. Or step forward, break everything, and face whatever came next. Her breathing remained steady, not because the moment was easy, but because it was certain. Her gaze moved once more across the room, taking in every detail, not as a victim, but as someone preparing for action. The guests, the power structures, the silent watchers, the fragile balance that still held everything together. All of it rested on one final decision. And she was about to make it. Slowly, deliberately, Elena took a step forward. Not away, not back, forward. That single movement changed everything. It was small in distance, but massive in meaning, because it signaled something unmistakable. She was no longer standing within the system. She was stepping outside of it. The room felt it instantly. The shift, the disruption, the break in expectation. Because actions like that do not go unnoticed. Daniel's posture tightened, barely, but enough, because now the moment had arrived. Stop. The word was not spoken aloud, but it existed in the tension, in the silence, in the invisible pressure that filled the room. Elena felt it. Of course she did, because she had lived under that pressure her entire life. But this time, she did not respond to it. She continued. Another step, closer to Adrian, closer to the line she was about to cross completely, because this was no longer hesitation. This was decision. Adrian did not move. He did not reach for her. He did not guide her, because this had to be her choice. Fully, completely, without influence. And she made it. Elena stopped beside him, not behind, not hidden, beside. That position spoke louder than anything else, because it defined her role. Not protected, not controlled, aligned, equal in presence, equal in consequence. The room shifted violently beneath its silence, because that action, that positioning, was not just personal, it was symbolic. It broke the structure completely. Daniel's control was gone, not taken by force, but rejected, and rejection is the one thing power cannot tolerate. His gaze hardened, the calm surface finally revealing the truth beneath it. Not emotion, not anger alone, possession and loss of it, because she had stepped out of his control, in front of everyone, without permission, without fear, and that was unacceptable. But it was already done, irreversible. The families understood it. The guests felt it. The system had fractured. Elena stood still, her posture grounded, her presence no longer uncertain, because now there was no going back. Her voice did not need to come. Her actions had already spoken. She was not part of this arrangement anymore. She was not part of their system. She was not someone to be controlled. She had chosen, and choice is what breaks control. Adrian's presence beside her remained steady, unchanged, but something had shifted, not in him, in the dynamic between them, because now she was not someone he was protecting. She was someone who had stepped into the same space, chosen the same war, accepted the same risk, and that created something different, not protection, alliance. Across the room, movement began, subtle, controlled, but real, because systems do not collapse without response. They react, they adapt, they push back, and this would not end quietly. But Elena did not move, did not retreat, did not break, because for the first time, she was not reacting to what others wanted. She was acting on what she chose, and that was freedom, not safety, not peace. Freedom. Her final realization settled deeply, because now she understood something fully. Freedom is not the absence of danger. It is the presence of choice within it, and she had chosen, completely, irreversibly. The wedding around her no longer symbolized union. It symbolized rebellion, a system broken, a structure rejected, a life left behind. And as she stood there, beside the most dangerous man in the room, not out of fear, not out of force, but out of her own decision, everything shifted into its final form. Power had changed hands. Control had been challenged. And the future was no longer decided by anyone else. Her final step came without hesitation. Forward, away from everything that had once defined her, towards something unknown, dangerous, uncertain, but hers. And as that moment sealed itself into reality, leaving no room for reversal, no space for doubt, no path back to who she once was, one final truth remained. She walked into that wedding as someone controlled, but walked out as someone no one could control,